Hi, it's John Daniell here. Just to let you know that Guyon and I have put together a follow-up to the service. This one is called The Agency, and it's the story of a Kiwi working in deep cover for CIA at the height of the Cold War. We've also spoken with some fascinating people for context and questions around Five Eyes and the situation with that intelligence alliance today. It's something that's especially relevant in the age of President Donald Trump. If you enjoyed the service, you'll love this. So just stay here to listen to the first episode, then click through in the show notes to The Agency, or you can find it on rnz.co.nz, Apple, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts.
He kōna ipurangi tēnei nā te reo irirangi o Aotearoa.
Just a heads up, listeners, this episode contains some adult language.
There's a couple of things I wanted to, before we kind of get started.
Yeah.
I don't want to sound coy, and I don't want to sound like I'm, important. I mean, I was a foot soldier. I wasn't making decisions about the Cold War.
We're in a hotel room in Masterton, about an hour and a half north of Wellington, at the very beginning of 2 days of interviews with a guy who was born and raised in this Wairarapa town. He's going to tell us an extraordinary story about how he worked for years at the tip of the spear of America's Central Intelligence Agency.
It is an extraordinary story in its own right, and it's also an important story because it shows just how deeply entwined New Zealand's intelligence community has been with its American ally, and the way they have targeted adversaries together. And it's going to help us understand how that relationship works today.
But I just need to be a little bit careful about some of the guys I dealt with. So a GRU officer and a KGB officer. Now, they could still be alive.
Yes.
One of those operations, I believe, was blown by Ames. So, but the other one I don't know. And if he's still alive...
Can I just get you to take that off?
Okay.
Otherwise he's going to be rustling against the thing.
And if he's still alive, then he could, even in this regime, could still be at risk. Okay. And I don't want to do that.
I'm just going to clap for the...
Okay.
Right now, it's fair to say our interviewee is a bit on edge. There's any number of unintended consequences that might come from talking to us on the record.
Yeah, he doesn't want to use the real names of the Russian intelligence officers he targeted in case there are real-life consequences for them. The modern Russian state, even today, is quite prepared to use lethal force against former intelligence officers it considers traitors.
When we talked last time, where I said that I used to go through customs, and I would then later meet in a hotel room with a colleague who would give me some of the equipment I needed, the sort of thing that might raise eyebrows going through customs. And you immediately said, did you carry a gun? And I don't want to talk about guns either, but no matter what I say, I sound like a wanker.
In fairness, we're all a bit nervous. I've known him since 2019, when Guyon and I interviewed him together for The Service, a series about a joint SIS MI6 raid on the Czech embassy at the height of the Cold War. But even before that, I knew he'd worked with CIA. And so for decades now, I've been hoping he'd talk about that, waiting for him to be ready to tell his story. As he put it right from the start, the Americans can be sticky about this kind of thing. Knowing this at the back of my mind, I've been wondering, what is the appropriate level of paranoia when you're dealing with one of the most powerful and secretive institutions in the world?
Yeah, we've all seen the movies, right? CIA and the USA, they're supposed to be the good guys. But sometimes it's hard to know.
Who's your source? What's his name? What's your source's name?
Look, what's going on? Why are these people after me?
That's one of Matt Damon's Jason Bourne films. I love that series. He had a journalist from The Guardian. They're at the Waterloo Station in London.
Yeah, a fictional journalist who's in danger because he's got a source telling him about, and I guess I would like to emphasise this, fictional CIA secrets.
You found something. You talked to someone inside Treadstone, someone who was there at the beginning. Who is it?
You know I can't tell you that.
You have no idea what you're into here. These people will kill you if they have to.
It doesn't end well for the guy from The Guardian.
Block all the exits. Give the asset a green light. Take them both out.
Because he doesn't listen.
I think someone's coming. I'm going for it. No.
Now, it's not as if we're expecting to be taken out, but we are dealing here with tightly held secrets. And that ability for US intelligence agencies, working hand in glove with our own people through the Five Eyes network to, intercept communications, monitor people they're suspicious about, that is very much a reality.
And so it's going to be interesting to see how they react when they become aware of the story we're all about to hear. Because while it's not unusual to hear from former CIA officers, they normally get official clearance before they talk to the media. So they know what they can say and what they can't.
But the man we are talking to has decided to ask for forgiveness rather than permission.
And we have no idea how that is going to play out. From Bird of Paradise Productions and RNZ, this is The Agency. I'm John Daniell.
And I'm Guyon Espiner, and this is episode 1, Knock Knock.
It hasn't changed since they were wheeling horses into Troy. Intelligence work goes on and on.
This is a story about New Zealand's place in the Five Eyes, the international intelligence alliance with the UK, the US, Australia and Canada.
And your team there, it's a very small group that works in your intelligence service. They are righteous.
It's also an intimate story about one man's work inside the belly of the beast and the risks he took.
So I was there for a week or so. I don't think I slept much because I knew that if this was going to happen, it wouldn't matter if I was walking around with an M16. They would have got me.
How useful did you think Five Eyes was as a relationship, as an alliance, as an intelligence sharing agreement when you became minister? Because you did 6 years as minister, didn't you?
Yep. As an intelligence sharing arrangement, it was very good. And we got benefits out of it and we contributed to it.
This is Andrew Little. He's now the Mayor of Wellington, but right through the Ardern government's time in power from 2017 to 2023, he was the minister in charge of the intelligence services, both the Security Intelligence Service, or SIS, and the service's signals intelligence sister, the Government Communications Security Bureau, the GCSB.
And we contributed to it meaningfully, but, proportionate to our size. But there's no question that there was some intelligence that we provided to Five Eyes partners that was of value to them. And they told me that, their ministers told me that.
The head of the CIA or someone, or
the ministers or national security, senior national security people like the Director of National Intelligence at the US or National Security Advisor in the UK expressed to me the appreciation. I gave examples.
They would give examples. This is your opportunity to tell me what they were.
Yeah.
I don't think I'm going to get that, am I?
No.
But there were specific examples. I mean, were they related to China? Can you give us any information about what those examples were?
No, I won't. No. Except that they were, and they were of value to those partners.
And they expressed that to you?
Yes.
Now, this is going to be an issue right the way through this story. A lot of information about New Zealand's role in the intelligence community, things that are done by the state in our name, is secret.
And while you can see why up to a point, it is also incredibly frustrating because it limits our understanding of what is really happening, which means we struggle to evaluate the stakes involved.
Yeah, and at a time when there's rising geopolitical tension, keeping the public informed goes to the heart of our democracy. But too often, we don't have well-informed discussions around security and defence, something Andrew Little acknowledged while talking to TVNZ's Jack Tame in 2023.
I don't think we have necessarily had a particularly well-informed debate about national security generally and, to some extent, defence.
Yeah, it just goes to show the tension of being in that position, doesn't it? And At the time he was minister for the intelligence agencies and defence too, you get the impression that he himself is frustrated to be making decisions based on what he hears inside the corridors of power without having buy-in from the public, because a lot of the time we are not having those conversations.
We don't have a deep-seated discussion about the policy or strategic issues that underpin it.
He did say some interesting things when he spoke to us, though.
How close is the relationship? Would people who worked for the SIS be able to go and work for CIA? And do CIA people come here? Do you have those sort of exchanges?
There are. Look, there are. I'm not sure how I would characterise it. Look, there are exchanges, I suppose, is probably for want of a better word. And because the agency, the Five Eyes partners in particular, work closely together, more so than pretty much any other group of intelligence agencies anywhere in the world. So there is that. I think New Zealand's relationship with each of the Five Eyes partners, UK, US, Australia, and Canada, is particularly close. Part of the sharing of information is each partner understanding, what their systems do and can do.
The story we're about to hear about this Kiwi working at the sharp end of the CIA took place more than 40 years ago now. But it sounds like that arrangement is still going on today.
Yes, and I know that there have been other more recent examples with other Five Eyes partners as well.
Right, because you actually know these people through your family background, right? Your parents both worked for SIS back in the day.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
What do you mean, I guess? Is it your turn to be cagey now?
Well, look, I don't want to make out that our place was some sort of constant churn of spy gossip, because it wasn't. A lot of the stuff I picked up from other people when I asked them direct questions because I was working on background or whatever.
Right, but some of it did just come up at home or in the course of normal conversation, didn't it?
Yeah, more often me eavesdropping as a kid. I do remember hearing about my stepfather going out for a drink with the man at the centre of the story because he was back in the country. That would have been years after he left CIA. But when I heard he'd been with the agency, I thought that was quite interesting. So I wanted to know more, and I got the brush off, which was pretty standard.
Quite interesting, all right. Any other good stories?
Well, we mentioned another one last time in that podcast series we did, The Service, which made me sit up. My mother talking about that nice man from the KGB.
Right. I don't suppose the KGB were flavour of the month in your house.
Correct.
So we're talking about Oleg Gordievsky, right? He pretty much saved the world back in 1983 and then, came and hung out at your place in Wellington later in the 80s.
Yeah, hung out is probably a stretch. And look, I didn't meet him. It was only Mum and Jim.
Right, but Gordievsky comes into this story too. We'll get to that a little bit later on, but the point is that for you, these are real people.
Exactly. They have a job to do. There's bosses and paperwork, and at weekends they're gardening or looking after kids. They're thinking about pension plans or holidays and whatnot, which I think is really worth remembering because the secrecy around the job means there's a kind of information vacuum. And we turn to made-up stories, which are, sure, entertaining, but also sensationalised and ultimately misleading.
Jason Bourne and Mission Impossible.
Yeah, basically, yeah.
All right, well, let's meet a real spy.
Marston in those days was a town funded and financed by very successful farming industry. Of course, my father worked for the council. He was a hydraulics control officer. Pretty much knew every farmer in this part of the Wairarapa.
This is Kit Bennets. He was born in 1951 and grew up in Masterton at a time when provincial New Zealand had one of the highest living standards in the world.
This was definitely a very successful part of the country, because we were living off the sheep's back even in the 60s at that stage. And a neat town to grow up in. You couldn't do anything that everybody knew who you were, and so you had to behave, but we had a lot of fun, lots of parties and things like that.
There wasn't just rock and roll in the 1960s. There was a generational clash around values.
And my father was always a kind of a Tory type supporter, and as a young person I was bucking against that, which was great. And there were interesting things happening in the world, troubles in the Middle East and the Cold War, the development of the Cold War. And my best subjects at school were history and English, and I really loved history.
Masterton must have felt even more distant from the major capitals then than it does now. But the Bennets family had been up close with world affairs, had seen how what happened overseas could have an effect on New Zealand.
Both my parents were interested in politics. My mother was also a veteran and served overseas. My father started off in the 1st Independent Company, so in the commando units, and that was then attached to the 8th Army. So he went through the Western Desert, was wounded 3 times. And like lots of those men, came back, didn't want to go back to university. Only found out later in life he'd been to university and didn't want to go back, just wanted his family around him. My father was always interested in politics, and I think he and I we were very close, but we used to argue fiercely about politics and things like that. And that
was there fun over the kitchen table?
Yeah, dinner table. And my mother would say, "Oh, fight you buggers."
But in this case, that generational clash was perhaps more a series of skirmishes rather than an all-out war.
I was not anti the war in Vietnam. I bought into the fact that it was the domino. That was the general thinking at the time.
Just a quick note here, the domino theory, that was the idea that if one country fell to communism, then its neighbour would fall too, and then the next neighbour, and so on.
Yeah, it was one of the justifications for the war in Vietnam, to stop the spread of communism before it hit other countries.
And there were the good guys and the bad guys, and we were the good guys. And, and communism could take over the world. And, I bought into that, not perhaps totally naively, but I guess a bit naively. I was a 15, 16, 17-year-old boy, and I was interested in lots of other things, like flying aeroplanes. I spent all my time at Hood Aerodrome, flying as I could. No, my parents couldn't afford for me to fly, so I worked as a telegraph boy and a postie at Christmas and that sort of thing to pay for my flying. And I had a plan that, if I could take girls flying in aeroplanes, how good was that going to be? Yeah, well, not so much. But anyway, I wanted a career in aviation, so I took subjects at school that would get me a career in aviation, got into the RNZF.
Kit Bennets had a pilot's licence, but he didn't just want to be a pilot. He wanted to be a fighter pilot.
But that wasn't what happened. His career took an unexpected turn during training.
We'd had a guy from the military come and talk to us about intelligence stuff, and I realised I'd always been interested in that, and not even so much in the glamour of spying, not the James Bond stuff. I was more fascinated with the politics of it all, and I don't think I can pretend to know anything about, or at that stage as a 19-year-old, any understanding of geopolitics or anything, but I was interested in it.
And that political element is really important to understand, because what the intelligence agencies do is all about politics, and that was particularly the case during the Cold War.
And we'll come back to this throughout the series. Counter-terrorism, I guess, is more on people's minds these days. You had 9/11, obviously, the Christchurch mosque attacks. But that political aspect, the alliances, the conflicts with other state actors, that is the fundamental reason for being for these agencies.
OK, so Kit Bennets, aged just 19, approaches his superiors to find out how he might get to work in intelligence.
And it was just when I suggested in the Air Force, and they kept saying, "No, that's not going to happen. You probably need to get more realistic." And I thought, no, I don't want to be realistic. I think I'd like to do it.
And so why did you get shoulder tapped? How did that...
Well, I actually contacted the service and heard nothing. And then they came and saw me and asked me if I'd like to do it. Yeah, so it was a combination between me dropping this note and this one guy in the service that said, and he took on myself and another guy who had both been through this and said, the Air Force has some of the most rigorous selection processes. We should take advantage of these guys.
Now, whether the SIS had seen something special in him or it was just a confluence of circumstances, Kit Bennets was not the usual kind of recruit.
And so I went in, but I was at that point the youngest, I was told, the youngest person ever to have worked in a Western intelligence service. And of course I didn't have a degree. And so I was on a training program for 2 years in the service. And that was when I learned how it all worked. I had a brief to read anything I wanted to. Now, intelligence services work on the need-to-know principle, but I was told to, if I was working in the registry, I could read whatever I wanted to read. And I read myself into the job. And at that point, I realised that I was not interested in what was counter-subversion.
Counter-subversion was looking at New Zealanders suspected of trying to subvert the government. And in the Cold War, that could mean people with legitimate political views were targeted.
Yeah, like the Vietnam War protesters, those protesting against Vietnam. They were pretty widespread on university campuses.
And I thought the only reason I was interested in going to, the anti-war stuff was to go to the parties afterwards. They would have been good. But, it just seemed to me that, I didn't believe that the revolution was coming and the commies were going to be running up the beaches at Lyell Bay. I mean, I don't know why anyone would run up the beaches at Lyell Bay. But anyway, I didn't think that, but I was fascinated by the Soviet target and by the USSR and by the Cold War. And one man in the organisation that I decided very early in my time, I want to work for him.
This is a guy we've previously called Jamie Mercer. Before Kit worked for him, he was my mother's boss at the SIS.
So he ran the Russia desk.
Yeah, I think he probably did a number of things at the SIS over the years. As I've said previously, his specialty was recruitment, and I know that he got a Christmas card every year from CIA. So you'd have to guess there was a connection there.
And we were firm friends until the day he died. And he was good. He was the best intelligence officer in New Zealand, and he was really, really good. And so it was great working for him. And so after I finished my 2 years training, I went up and by then I'd been doing some surveillance and things like that, but then I went up to be a counter-espionage intelligence officer, and I was so young and I looked like a boy that there was an issue with me out interviewing people because I had no credibility. They looked like they were being interviewed by a schoolboy because I had freckle face and I was just a kid.
As it happens, Kit Bennets is just 23 years old when he becomes a central figure in what initially looks like a big win, but will become something of a disaster for the SIS and potentially career-ending for him.
Yeah, so I'd been in the job for about a year and we had a reorganisation in the service and we set up this new branch, and 18 days after it was set up, I was on the surveillance that caught Dr. Such.
Right. Okay, so the Such case. We don't want to get too deep into the weeds here. It's relatively well-trodden ground.
Yeah, we covered a lot of this in the Service podcast, and Kit Bennets himself would go on to write a book about it 30 years later called Spy.
But it's worth revisiting here because it exemplifies the fundamental issue with intelligence services who are operating secretly, wielding considerable power at the heart of the state. Do you trust them?
Yeah, you want to feel that your spies are credible and apolitical, right? That they're going to use good judgment to get it right, and they're not going to take sides.
So let's just go over the basic facts of the Such case again. In April 1974, SIS surveillance,
starring freckle-faced 23-year-old Kit Bennets,
are targeting the KGB resident, Dmitry Razgovorov, the guy in charge of intelligence at the Soviet embassy, as he drives out one night.
And that was just a 2-car surveillance.
And they get lucky.
We got this clandestine meeting at the Karori Bowling Club. So anyway, we housed him, which is the standard thing. After the meeting, you don't worry about where the Russian goes. You've got to find out who that guy is. We followed him to his home in Brooklyn, up some of the windiest streets at the back of Arrow Street there that you've ever been up. Housed him at this house. Still didn't know who he was. And then we'd housed him to this location. So when we got to work first thing in the morning, who lives at that house?
All right, so this is a big deal because it looks like the SIS have caught a big fish. Bill Such, he's been a really high-flying public servant, and he was still highly influential. He was a public intellectual, a writer, economist, historian.
And very much a man of the left, a man who had been close to the Labour Prime Minister, Norman Kirk, who had to be told what had happened because the PM had to sign off on what would happen next.
When Prime Minister was briefed, it was Norman Kirk, and the Brigadier went to brief him.
The Brigadier was the long-time head of the service, Brigadier Sir William Gilbert. Kit Bennets had been charged with delivering supporting evidence to the PM.
I spent the whole weekend drawing maps that were taken to the Prime Minister. So I kind of did everything. Had to catch him and draw the maps as well.
Because it's important to convince him with the evidence they have at that stage. I mean, this is, as they say, huge if true.
Not just from a political or espionage angle, it must be personally devastating for this famously decent man, Norman Kirk, to hear that someone he trusted and respected was meeting with the KGB and apparently handing over state secrets to the Soviets.
But I remember the Brigadier came back and said, and he'd said this to me personally, that the Prime Minister was, he didn't use the term gutted, not a term he would have used, but he said he was horrified and desperately disappointed. He was really upset.
So the SIS runs surveillance for months.
So we ultimately saw 4 clandestine meetings, and I was lucky enough to see all of them.
But bungle it when they go to snatch him because the heavy surveillance team lose him at the crucial moment, just as they want to pounce.
And the last one up in Arrow Street that everybody knows about in the pouring rain, and I stuffed that one up because he got in a taxi and took about a 2-minute ride when we had him walking up the street.
And Bill Such hands off an envelope to the KGB. The envelope is given to a driver who takes off, goes straight back to the embassy and can't be touched.
So Bill Such is not caught red-handed because he's already passed on this envelope. But he is arrested all the same.
And he is held overnight. Now, he doesn't deny that he was meeting the Russian and had met him previously because Razgovorov had approached him. But he says it was something to do with Zionism and China, just an innocent conversation. It's all a bit confused, but this is because he says the Russian was hard to understand.
And Dr. Such refuses to talk to the SIS.
Which raises a pretty interesting counterfactual. If he had talked, we'd not have known about it for decades, if at all.
But when all the attempts to coerce him run out, he is ultimately charged by police under the Official Secrets Act, which brings the whole thing into the court system and the public arena.
Now, that is not what the SIS had planned for. The whole operation has been about getting Such to talk to them. The SIS are an intelligence agency. They want information. They're not there to do law enforcement.
We never wanted a trial. It's the last thing you want. What we wanted was Such to cooperate, tell us about his time doing it, which it later transpired was from the early 1950s, from about 2 years before I was born, he was there. And we just wanted to know what he'd been doing, who he'd been talking to. There wouldn't have been any prosecution. And there's precedent for this in the United States and in the UK. You know, they allowed people to get on with their lives so long as they told all, put their hands up to it, and it was never in the interests of any intelligence service to prosecute them.
But as the case goes to trial, public opinion is split, and largely along party lines.
The country was saying, oh, he's as guilty as hell. And I was saying, no, it's been, the thought police have stitched him up. So it was this, splitting the ways. And Labor were, I think it was tricky for them.
Labor Prime Minister Norman Kirk has been convinced by the SIS, but the intelligence agency wouldn't release all the information they had on Dr. Such.
And without proof, Labor supporters who are already sceptical of the SIS, who they feel target left-wingers because of their political beliefs, these Labor people can't believe that Bill Such was really spying for the Soviets.
Because they had to see what he was passing. And this classic view of, passing the submarine plans over, which is not what Such was doing. By then, Such was an agent of influence.
Now, this is conjecture from Kit Bennets. We have no evidence of this. He's extrapolating.
They would be asking him to, perhaps you can move things this way. What is the current view of the Prime Minister? What do they think about that? All of those sorts of things were what he was doing. And, of course, he had those pen portraits where he was basically replacing himself, who was going to take over from him.
But this part of the story, the pen portraits, is not conjecture.
And they were pretty nasty sort of pen portraits of people who were essentially his friends, who he was lining up to take over from him.
Now, these pen portraits, we're going to refer to them as profiles, if you like. They're basically potted biographies, aren't they, John?
Yeah, they're just short bios, a long paragraph or two on each person.
Yeah, I mean, these profiles, they were found in Dr. Such's office, but they were not used in evidence at trial.
British intelligence were asked to send an expert over who would testify to their lining up with the KGB formula for profiles. So things like what they think of the Soviet Union, their interests, weaknesses and so on. But the Brits said, absolutely not. We've no interest in going public.
They didn't want to know about it, did they? It was basically, the message from MI6 was basically clean up your own mess. So while an analysis of these profiles has been released, it's less convincing without the files themselves. But we've obtained these files and we're going to publish them because we think it's important to establish facts wherever possible, especially in this rather murky world of espionage.
If you don't have the facts, you're going to struggle to understand the real issues. And look, you can sympathise with the family who've always denied he was guilty. And it was, and still seems to be, awkward for Labour and other left-leaning organisations who've been targeted by the intelligence services and no doubt treated a bit heavy-handedly in the past.
Yeah, but this is pretty important because these profiles really do establish beyond doubt that Dr. Bill Such was spying for the Soviet Union.
We can only guess at the extent to which he passed on information. And look, there's a detailed article on the website around all this.
Yeah, it's a good read, this. It's a great piece written by Sarah Gaetanos. She's a highly respected historian. She's got really detailed knowledge of the Such case because she wrote the book. She wrote an award-winning book on Dr. Such's wife, Shirley Smith.
And what we can say here is that basically there are three big bits of evidence against Such. Firstly, he is observed by the SIS meeting on multiple occasions around Wellington with Dmitry Razgovarov of the KGB. Secondly, the KGB archive, smuggled out of Russia in the 1990s, identifies him in all but name. His code name is Maori, his personal and professional information lines up exactly, and he's recruited in 1950.
And finally, these profiles, they're of 6 people, all civil servants, all of them now dead. You can read these as they were written. Obviously, for a foreign reader with an interest in how the subjects feel about the Soviet Union, but also things like their vulnerabilities and their fields of expertise.
The SIS determined the profiles were probably written by Dr. Such and handed on to the KGB as information that could be used for recruitment. We debated whether or not to give you these names. They are, as far as we know, entirely innocent people who happen to be in senior public service roles at the time Such was working for the Soviets. So there is perhaps no sense in dragging them into this. But on the other hand, this is how many of the big stories in our nation's history evolve. Bit by bit, we learn more. And with the addition of each chapter, a more detailed picture emerges. These guys were unwitting characters in a dramatic story. But characters they were.
So let's just look briefly at one example. Someone at the Asian side of external affairs, which is effectively today's MFAT, or Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade. And it says, as a young man, he was one of the left-wingers suspected by the Americans, but they didn't have enough evidence to ask for his removal. His sympathies, therefore, have to be kept very quiet, and he himself is very careful at expressing his left-wing views. However, he is most sympathetic to the Soviet Union.
The twist is that, for whatever reason, Bill Such was found not guilty in court. And as a result, the case is still considered a grey area, even by those who have been in the seat of power, presiding over the intelligence agencies.
What are your reflections on the Such case? Because that was historic in many ways. It was the only one ever tried under the Official Secrets Act.
Oh, look, I can't say I've looked closely at the information about Bill Such.
This is from the interview we did with Andrew Little.
There was a time, that time in the 70s in particular, where the Cold War was highly elevated and you'd had the Vietnam War had been justified on the grounds that it was about, pushing back international communism, and the conservative parties around the world would easily play up the communist threat, I think, as unions used the statutory powers that they had to press hard for wage increases. But whether or not Dr. Such had done anything wrong, put aside the unlawfulness because he'd been found not guilty, whether he had done something wrong or immoral, I'm not in a position to judge it on the basis of what I know.
At the time, it was an enormous schism in New Zealand society. Left and right people lined up and said, Red's under the beds or you guys are guilty. I mean, it was a time of real danger, I think, and we're seeing it a little bit again now. I mean, do you hear an echo there? Is there a danger in terms of the intelligence services not being able to be trusted by the New Zealand population?
Look, what we're seeing today is obviously a greater polarisation. There is a buying into a set of narratives, less about the fear of communism, which was what was being stoked years ago, the sort of international communist movement, and more on the kind of the extreme right and hard right sort of end of politics, and the sort of marginalisation of different communities, including migrant communities and others.
But are they trusted?
There's always going to be those in the community who are, if not sceptical, at least suspicious about state power, and whether expressed through the police or intelligence agencies. And some of that it is right to have sceptical voices in the community about that. That is part of the kind of the public or democratic check and balance on them. I think, on average, people accept that the agencies are there doing a job and are doing the best they can.
Within these intelligence agencies, the culture of secrecy, of need to know, is deeply embedded.
But the Such case forced a number of SIS personnel into court under supposedly secret identities. Kit Bennets was Mr S. But New Zealand being what it is, that cover wasn't going to last for long.
I was Mr S, but having come from the little town of Masterton, as I walked into the magistrates' court and I look along the press benches, and sitting there is Les Lang, and Les Lang was a journo here at the Times Age, close friend of my father's, drink down at the Soldiers Club, known me since I was a boy, you know. I thought, oh God, this is a tiny place. Anyway, about a month afterwards, I was up here with my parents, and Dad and I went down for a beer at the Soldiers Club, and Les was there. And I said, hey, Les, and he said, oh, you had an interesting time, Kit? I said, yes, I have. I said, you didn't bottle on me, did you? And he said, oh, no, I didn't need to. He said, you hadn't even started giving evidence, and your name, your full name came across came all the way along the press bench.
His name is eventually broadcast on the radio and then widely disseminated.
And what I was really worried about was that I was never going to be able to work again, let alone ever go and work in clandestine operations for the Americans.
When you set such great store on secrecy, when it's built deep into the roots of the culture, any exposure is going to feel dangerous. But as it turned out, his fears and the fears of the SIS around these secret identities being revealed were never realised.
Everyone forgot about Mr S and Mr T and Mr X, and we just got on with our jobs.
And so in 1979, 4 years on from the Such trial, even after having been publicly outed, Kit Bennets is able to go into a secret role.
We had this little program going, and I'd just say at the beginning, you know, people saying, well, why would the NZSIS be working with CIA? Well, we're a member of Five Eyes, and you know, when you see these international pacts and agreements, what we see on television always is the conference where all the people sit around a big round table and they get funny jackets and they have all the flags there, and people imagine that this is what these alliances and things are, and that's not what they are at all, of course. Things happen below that, and that's where I was, well down the list, but cooperation between countries. And so the reason why the agency could use us was because of the way I spoke. I didn't have an American accent. And why would anyone be concerned about a New Zealander? We're, in that regard, politically very beige. Yes, definitely members of Five Eyes, definitely a part of the Western Alliance, no doubt about that. But, you know, bottom of the world, couple of islands, pretty harmless, really.
So if you're surprised to hear that a New Zealander was working for CIA, chances are the Soviets would be too.
So in other words, the KGB wouldn't necessarily see us coming. Whereas someone who's had a a university education at one of the Ivy League universities and speaks with a Boston accent, this guy's from the agency. So that's where Australians and New Zealanders were particularly useful to them.
By 1979, Kit Bennets had been working for the SIS for nearly a decade, and throughout that time had been in counter-espionage.
Working against the Soviets and the East Europeans, and I was asked if I would be interested in being on this project. And I had to think about that for about 2.5 seconds and said yes, I would. So then there was an interview program with the American Chief of Station, and we went to lunch at the Wellesley Club. And
They would have been attached to the embassy at that
yes, yeah. In all American embassies, everywhere there is a CIA presence. And
that would be true today, wouldn't it?
absolutely. Oh, I can't imagine. Yeah, it would definitely be true today. I would certainly hope so. And so the Chief of Station, the KGB call it the KGB resident, but they are normally clandestine, and there'll be people in the embassy that are working for the KGB or the GRU and undeclared. But in a country like New Zealand, Australia, Canada, Great Britain, Germany, the agency people there would be identified and known to the local intelligence service, mainly doing liaison work. That's what they were doing.
So he has this lunch meeting with the CIA Chief of Station here at the Wellesley Club in central Wellington, just a stone's throw from the Beehive. It's the start of an interview process that is obviously successful.
Then when I got the job, that was good, and I worked for that Chief of Station so it was a 2-year program, and mine went for 6.5 years. So I went off to the United States and trained, which was really fantastic.
In the next episode, we'll get to grips with that part of the story.
Now, I did go to Langley quite often, and it was just a matter of jumping out of my apartment, driving down onto the George Washington Parkway and heading up to the sign that said CIA next exit, and went in there, went through the cattle grid there with all the stars on the wall, determined that I didn't want a little silver fern added to it.
This is the famous CIA Memorial Wall in the entrance to the main old building there, with rows of stars, each one representing an individual CIA officer who died on active duty.
Yeah, there's a massive new building now, but of course, when Donald Trump went to CIA at Langley on day one of his first presidency back in January of 2017, he stood in front of that wall in the old building to leverage the symbolism.
There is nobody that feels stronger about the intelligence community and the CIA than Donald Trump. There's nobody.
More than 20,000 people work there across a whole range of jobs, everything from IT to management.
Yeah, you have a lot of analysts. It's a particularity of CIA in terms of Western intelligence to have so many people sifting through information they get from the field, cross-cutting that with local media and so on. You also have the case officers, many, if not most of whom, will be attached to embassies.
Like the Chief of Station in Wellington.
So I met all the people in the East Asia Division, and then I went up to meet the DDO, the Deputy Director of Operations, who is, from the operational point of view in those days, that person was God. He was really very good to me and polite to me and told me what he expected of me and said how grateful he was that New Zealand was playing its part in the never-ending battle, and it was good.
And we talk about CIA officers when we mean people who actually work for the agency, don't we? The agents are the people who get recruited, most often foreigners prepared to pass on secrets.
That's right. When it comes to the people we often think of in terms of CIA, the deep cover operatives, they're really a very small percentage. The numbers are not publicly available, but they've been estimated differently at different times, anywhere from 70 to perhaps a couple of hundred.
And these are the NOCs, N-O-C, the officers working under non-official cover, largely posing as business people so they can travel wherever and meet a wide range of foreigners and still look legit. But the downside, and it's a big one, they are not covered by diplomatic immunity in the way that they would be if they were attached to an embassy.
Exactly. They're on their own. So if they get caught, there's no guarantee the cavalry will arrive.
No. And while we're in CIA headquarters in Langley, we did talk about those films, about how they were perhaps misleading, but this is the site of that famous scene in, and I hate to return to this, but Mission Impossible, isn't it? Where Tom Cruise, he breaks in through the air conditioning ducts or something, and he hangs down on a wire from the ceiling to get the knock list.
Holy Mother of God. The knock list.
Yeah, this is the central MacGuffin in the story. Someone has stolen the list of CIA officers operating under non-official cover. And then Tom Cruise, as Ethan Hunt, has to steal it again for some reason. I'd be surprised if all those identities were really compiled into quite such a convenient target, but it does make for some high stakes.
Stolen one half of a CIA knock list, a record of all our deep cover agents working in Eastern Europe. For security reasons, the knock list is divided in two.
In any case, having it stolen would be a serious issue.
If that list gets out into the open, the names of our agents in every country in Eastern Europe will be up for grabs to the highest bidders. Third world terrorists, arms dealers, drug lords.
Certainly Tom Cruise is quite exercised when things go wrong.
Do you read me? The list is in the open!
Anyway, as you've probably guessed by now, when Kit Bennets goes to Langley, joins the CIA as an exchange officer and starts his training, he isn't going to be an analyst or an IT guy or hang around in the office.
Kit Bennets is going to become a knock. The Agency was produced, written and hosted by John Daniell and me, Guyon Espiner. Our executive producer for RNZ was John Hartevelt, and our executive producer for Bird of Paradise Productions was Noel McCarthy.
Original music by Anthony Tonnen, graphic design by Oliver Wall. For RNZ, sound production and final mix was by Mark Chesterman. Production coordinator was Brianna Uritich-Grieg. Thanks to Steve Burridge, Ali Marsden, Jeremy Ansell and William Saunders. Thanks to Megan Whelan, and thanks also to Susan Baldacci.
The visual director at RNZ was Cole Eastham Farrelly, and our camera operator was Jess Charlton. Thanks also to Sarah Gaetanos for the article about Bill Such that appears on rnz.co.nz.
Thanks also to CNN, TVNZ, BBC, the ABC, Universal and Paramount. To read more about the documents and articles we've mentioned, you can go to rnz.co.nz/The Agency, and you can see the links in the show notes.